Somebody once told me that the artistic expressions of a town, the artistic expressions of a community, of a country, are the representation of their true soul. The paintings they make, the songs they play, the books they write, the stories they tell, those are the reflections of the essence of that country. Some of you know I'm originally from Colombia, and if you put this in the Colombian context, there are two words that come into mind. Magic realism. Magic realism is this artistic style where, mostly in literature, where there is this very realistic description of everyday life events, but suddenly something completely unexpected and absolutely hard to believe happens. It's like a magical experience. If perhaps one of the most representative figures of magic realism is the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. His most famous book, for which he won the Nobel Prize for, is 100 Years of Solitude. How many people here are familiar with that book, 100 Years of Solitude? Okay. Because if you are not, there's spoiler alert. I'm going to crush it. So, 100 Years of Solitude is the story of this family saga, the Buendia family. And they live in this town, the town of Macondo. Macondo is a fictional town. It's a fictional town, but it's a representation of Colombia in a way. And the Buendia family is a representation of Colombians. And it's a family, and the book starts with this Colonel Aureliano Buendia, and he's waiting to be shot down by a firing squad. And while he's waiting to be killed, he starts having these flashbacks back to his youth. And he starts remembering his history, and he starts remembering the history of his father and his grandfather. And then he goes and jumps into the future, and he thinks about the history of his children, his son, his grandson, his granddaughter, his descendants. The end of the book jumps several generations, and they will go through all the stories of the Buendias until there is this descendant of Colonel Aureliano Buendia. His name is Aureliano Babilonia. Suddenly, Aureliano Babilonia, he finds himself in this room. He walks into this room, and he finds these pergamins. He starts reading these pergamins, and he realizes that these pergamins are telling the story of his family. And he goes and he sees all the story of Aureliano Buendia, of all of those before him, of his fathers, of his grandfather. And then he gets very curious. And then he's like, I have to look into the future. I have to see when is the date of my death. And he takes the last page of those pergamins and he starts reading. And before he finishes the page, just as he started actually reading the page, he realizes that he's never going to leave that room where he is. Because that page is the last page also of his life. And at that precise moment, a hurricane comes, sweeps out the house where he is, ends up and wipes out the whole Buendia family. And the book ends saying, because we have realized that those that are condemned to 100 years of solitude don't have a second chance. So 100 Years of Solitude is a book of violence, because it goes throughout the history of Colombia, centers of violence. It's a book that reflects on the magic, on the passion of Colombia. It's a book that makes us wonder, are we condemned as a nation to repeat same tragedy one generation after the other? Is our history already written, and there's nothing we can do because our destiny is written? But it can also be a book of hope, a book that can tell us, no, we do have second chances. And countries that have gone over tragedies generations after generations cannot only wait to see if their history is written, but can write their own history. And Macondo is a reflection of Colombia, and the Buendias are a reflection of Colombians, of the human conditions. But Macondo can be anywhere where violence has been persistent, anywhere where violence has been prevalent for decades, for generations, where we think we have no hope to end this violence cycle. But it tells us, yes, we do. We can do it. I'm going to tell you two stories from Colombia, from peacebuilding organizations in Colombia, that reflect some of this spirit, this magic realism that Colombia experiences. But before going that, I want to jump a little bit into another continent, into my other country, into Spain, and make another literary reference, that of Don Quixote de la Mancha, which is, as you know, perhaps the most famous book in Spanish literature. This is a guy, it's a person that he gets so much into his books, he starts reading that he starts building a complete new reality, and he builds this parallel universe, and suddenly his books become his reality. This is, of course, a story of a man who goes out to live his dreams, but to me it's also a representation of the power of words, to create our own universe, to create our own reality. And that takes me back, that reflection, again to Colombia, to one of the experiences that we are having. One of the dialogue processes that we have been supporting and working with under the GPPAC framework is a project called the Intergenerational Dialogues, precisely. And the whole premise of this is that we need to talk. When I was asking, okay, so what's your theory of change? What do you want to do? He said, theory of change. He's like, okay, well, if I had to think about my theory of change, it should be that people don't realize, but our conversations create our reality. What we decide to talk about, the way that we talk about it, who we talk about it with, the words that we use, how we refer to certain person, to certain people, that's shaping our reality. That is creating our universe. And he said, we realize that. And what we want to do is simply offer space for people to create their own reality. So what they do is that they go into towns, very small towns, where 5,000 to 10,000 people, who have been perhaps the towns most affected by this 50 years of conflict in Colombia. And they simply organize conversations. So they go into the town hall, they talk to the schools, they talk to the mayor, and they put these tables in the main plaza of the towns, and they put some drinks, and people come, and they organize these small discussions. And they try to mix older people, the grandparents, with the children, with the school, and they reflect, and they think about what is our past, where do we come from, what is our perspective. But especially they reflect about what's going to be our future, what are we going to build together. And that, in the middle of those conversations, these moments of construction, of building happen, and people start thinking about their future and start transcending and start forgetting and forgiving about their past, not forgetting, but forgiving their past and thinking about their future. And this magical transformation, this magic realism takes place, and they start building the future together. This takes me to the second story that I wanted to mention, and it's about, again, also in Colombia, another organization, and it's about the power of forgiveness. This organization is called Fundacin para la Reconciliación. It's led by a Catholic priest, this Father Leonel Narváez. When I was talking to him a few months ago, I asked him, okay, so what is your initiative? What is this about? And he says, well, people don't realize, but if you think about it, 80% of acts of violence that there are in Colombia, but Colombia or anywhere else, have one reason. And he actually pulled some statistics from the government that showed that he had scientific proof of that. He said, the number one reason for violence is retaliation, revenge. He said, and if we manage to stop the cycle of violence, of revenge, of retaliation, then we will really move forward towards reconciliation, towards preventing, towards breaking the cycle of violence that we have gone generation after generations. But it seems like the human condition is programmed for retaliation. No? Since we are little, somebody takes our toy and we just go like, "Wah!" No. And it seems like that's the natural reaction. That's what we do. But he said, yes, that's what we do, but we also have the capacity to learn. And where do we learn? We learn at schools. So his project, he created these schools of forgiveness. He said, we are going to teach people the power of forgiveness, but we're going to tell them how to forgive, and we're going to make them experience forgiveness. And he told me this story of this person who walked into one of these schools of forgiveness. He was a former guerrilla member who had already demobilized some years ago, but he had some issues that were still tormenting him, and he heard about this school, and he went there to see what this was all about. So he started sharing his story. Okay, what do you need to be forgiven for? So he said, well, when I was a rebel, a combatant, we assaulted this military base. It was a very violent attack, and in the middle of that, we decided to burn the military base with all the people who were inside. And this story was still haunting him. There was this guy who was listening to him from the School of Forgiveness. He got up, it's a person who was blind, a bit older than him, and he said, oh yeah, I remember that story. I remember that story. I was a captain in the military, That was my post. And that was the day when we were attacked, and that was the day when I became blind. And destiny had put them together in the same place at the same moment. Magic realism, again. How magic realism. And they decided since then, of course they talked, they went to their process, and today both of them lead some processes in these schools of forgiveness, and they work together to bring more people experience that transformation that they went through into thinking about how to deal with their past. Because yes, they had to acknowledge the past, the pain that they went through, but also now they had to transcend that and say, okay, how are we going to build the future together despite our past? These reflections take me to think about the current context, about the power of words, the power of stories, about building our reality, about building our own story. We are in a moment right now when we are faced with several stories. Stories of fear, stories of be careful with the other, stories of this is us versus them, stories of no, we have to survive, stories of fear, in one word. And it is our responsibility to counter those stories of fear for stories of hope, stories of saying, no, we have more in common. It's more than what unites us than what divides us. Stories of thinking, what can we do together? Stories that tells us, no, we are in control. We can build our own reality. Because if we don't, there are others who are building other realities, other universes that we might not like. As peace builders, we work with the powers of words, with the power of words. Usually, people who don't understand our work say, yeah, but what do you do? What exactly do you do? It seems like it's a talk shop. I say, yes, it is indeed. It's a talk shop. But talk, the words, those are our tools. And by talking and the dialogues, that's our workshop. And that's how we're creating. That's how we're creating our reality, by talking. So, as peace builders, we have the responsibility to talk. We have the responsibility to create. We have the responsibilities to write our own stories. The stories that, yes, can be marked by realism, but that especially should be marked by magic. Thank you very much.